Oh my god!
You've probably seen this clip before. World number 1, Magnus Carlsen, is facing the world champion, Gukesh. Frustrated by his loss, Magnus Carlsen slams the table. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. To understand the story behind it, what it means for both players, and how it led to one of the tightest races for the title of Norway chess champion, you have to go back in time. Prior to this tournament, Gukesh and Magnus had only faced each other 4 times in classical chess. This was mainly due to Gukesh being so unbelievably young compared to his success, and Magnus Carlsen avoiding classical chess the past couple of years. That being said, their first 2 games at Tata Steel and Norway Chess in 2023 both ended in draws. But when they met in the quarterfinals of the 2023 Chess World Cup, someone had to come out victorious. Magnus took the first game and held a draw in the second to knock Gukesh out. With this small outdated sample size of games, we had no clue what to expect on the classical side, but if there was a draw and we headed to a shorter game of Armageddon, then things were different. Magnus Carlsen has recently been not only very active, but dominant in blitz and rapid time formats. And over the past year and a half, in quicker time formats in both regular and freestyle chess, Magnus holds a record of 4 wins, 1 draw, and 1 loss over Gukesh. With Norway chess being the battleground for their classical fights, and without a warm-up, the first colossal matchup of Magnus Carlsen vs Gukesh was taking place in the very first round. With the white pieces, Magnus played d4, and on just move 2, he would begin his test of Gukesh, as Magnus played knight c3, a move not typically played at the peak of chess, that aimed to take Gukesh into unfamiliar territory. Gukesh, however, a couple moves later, would play bishop g4, a move that then threw off Magnus, and had him questioning himself.
You thought for a few minutes, played bishop g4, and I just realized, well, I don't know anything. So I responded the way you often do, especially in the first round, in the absolute kind of wussiest way possible.
Gukesh begins crashing through on the queen side by launching pawns forward. This results in a pass pawn on the a-file, a pawn which, after the marching up of Magnus's king, he would surrender for counterplay. With both players playing accurately, the engine reading completely even, and their times running down into mere minutes, we were approaching the climax of the game. Magnus forces a trade of rooks, then a trade of pawns, and now we find ourselves here, with completely equal material, but 2 separate pairs of connected pass pawns making up the true battle. Both sides push towards queening. Magnus is now threatening the push and threatening Gukesh's knight. He had an important decision to make: sacrifice the knight to push for promotion, or move the knight and allow Magnus's pawn to advance faster than your own pawn. He thinks for a moment before playing the right move, pawn h3, electing to play a line where both sides queen, but Magnus cannot escape the check safely without giving up his rook, making it a complete draw. After 4 minutes of thought, Magnus takes the knight, and both sides are just 1 square away from promotion. Gukesh delivers a check, and while it may be tempting, running up and away would lose the game completely for Magnus, as Gukesh could just check and pick up the knight, or if the queen blocks, then pick up the rook. Magnus avoids the trap, both sides promote, and Gukesh now finds himself in a bit of time trouble, with 10 seconds added each move, and 20 seconds on his clock. He doesn't have much time to make something happen against Magnus's 1 minute 20. Gukesh thinks for 15 seconds before playing queen h6 check, a mistake, because now instead of perpetual checks, he allows Magnus Carlsen to play a set of perfect moves. In fact, it is the only sequence that Magnus can play to win the game. Magnus evades all of Gukesh's checks, and all of a sudden now, Gukesh has run out of good checks, so he grabs the knight back. Magnus needs to find the correct checks to seal the game. With 2 seconds left on his clock, he starts off the sequence with queen h8. Then brings his rook into it, and now Gukesh's king is naked in the center of the board. Magnus can skewer Gukesh's king and rook, but it's not a good move, because after taking, Gukesh can play repeated checks and squeak out a draw. Instead, Magnus resists and plays the only winning move, rook e6 check. Now Gukesh has no way of avoiding either checkmate, losing his rook, losing his queen, or all of the above. Gukesh sinks into his chair, knowing Magnus has found it. He resigns. Not only had Magnus won, but he had played 9 straight top engine moves in crunch time, beginning when Gukesh made his mistake to seal the deal. Gukesh hadn't played badly, Magnus had just played better. He picked his moment, squeezed with precision, and once again reminded the world why he was at the top. And just in case anyone missed the message, Magnus made it crystal clear with a tweet after the game: "You come at the king, you best not miss." In the next few rounds, both players had mixed results. Magnus lost 2 Armageddon games, one to Hikaru in dramatic fashion, and another to a brilliant Wei Yi. Gukesh meanwhile stumbled against Arjun, but bounced back with a clean win over Hikaru. By round 4, Magnus was back in form, with a classic grind against Arjun, while Gukesh was still trying to build momentum. With half the tournament done, everything was business as usual for Magnus Carlsen. He had a 1.5 point lead on the field and was in the driver's seat to win the tournament. The same could not be said about Gukesh, who was tied for last place with 5.5 points. Nevertheless, this still represents perfectly the chaos of such a tournament, as everyone trading blows with each other meant no one was ever too far away from the lead. And the following round was a great example of that, as once again, Magnus Carlsen was playing Gukesh. This time having the white pieces, Gukesh plays the Rui Lopez. For the first 20 moves, things moved as normal. After that, Magnus started doing what he's best at. Every single move, he advanced piece by piece against Gukesh's reactionary defense. Gukesh plays the first mistake in Queen A2, allowing Magnus to attack the center at its base and gain a tight hold on Gukesh. After a trade of queens, Gukesh is unable to move his knight out of harm's way, because if he did, then his whole center and position would completely fall apart.
It's just positional domination, it feels like right now. Gukesh isn't even moving his knight now, thinking of other ways to keep things going. Maybe he doesn't need to rush, but Magnus still in control.
Not only that, but he fell to just 10 minutes to play 10 moves before receiving increment. After stepping up his king and sliding his rook into the center, Magnus finally takes the hanging knight, before deciding he didn't want it and gave it back, with the intention of taking on e4, uprooting the center and pinning the knight to the vulnerable king. Up until now, Carlsen was playing like a machine. Every time Gukesh had the slightest of missteps, Magnus was there to capitalize. He had built an advantage so crushing that the commentators were expecting a resignation from Gukesh.
How long does this game go on? Can Gukesh fight?
Not much longer.
He might just resign any moment. He's down at 5 minutes. We still haven't reached move 40, so no time increment for him. The world champion in huge trouble. It looks like the rating favorite, the world #1 on the ranking list. Magnus Carlsen is going to get the double over the world champion.
Finding himself down heavily in the game, with less time on the clock against the former world champion, Gukesh doesn't back down or give up. He secures the second rank, limits the squares for his opponent's king, and finally when Magnus completes his king walk, instead of grabbing the free pawn, Gukesh attacks Magnus's king. With both players being down to under 3 minutes, anything could happen. Magnus plays f6, an inaccuracy, because after thinking for a minute and a half, Gukesh found rook f3. And now a pair of rooks needs to be traded if Magnus doesn't want to get checkmated. Not only that, but Gukesh's knight joins the party, forking the king and Magnus's weak pawns. Out of nowhere, Gukesh was bringing the game back to life. After defending his rook and claiming the free pawn, Gukesh delivers a check, restricting Magnus's king to the back rank, down to under a minute on both their clocks, in a position filled with tactics. Gukesh forks Magnus's rook and f-pawn. Gukesh had found a way to turn what was pure dominance from Magnus into doubt, as the look on his face shifted. And after half a minute of thought, Magnus made a big mistake. He played knight e2, revealing an attack on the rook and a check on the king simultaneously. Carlsen saw that capturing the knight came with a check, meaning Gukesh could also pick up the rook and end the sequence up a full piece. However, he had something different in mind, with Gukesh's king being walled off and his knight being on the edge of the board. Magnus was banking on his d-pawn promoting. He pushes it as Gukesh scrambles to get back. Magnus moves his king up to avoid any forks, and Gukesh has just 30 seconds to find a move, knight a4, the only move that wins him the game. With his clock winding down, he finds it. Magnus reinforces his pawn and looks for counterplay, but Gukesh calmly pushes his own, turning it into a runaway threat. Hand trembling, Magnus inches his king forward. Gukesh repositions his knight twice. The base of Magnus's pawns is about to fall, and he cannot promote in time either. Realizing his position was collapsing, Magnus snapped.
Oh my god!
In a moment that felt almost too perfect, Magnus's slam toppled his king, while Gukesh's remained upright, a symbolic reflection of how the game had gone. And the internet went wild. The clip exploded, going insanely viral overnight. Across all of social media, it racked up millions and millions of views. The New York Times, The Guardian, NBC, CNN, just to name a few. It was everywhere. Even chess as a whole spiked in searches worldwide on Google, alongside with the names of the players. Not only that, but memes were popping up left, right, and center. Even FIDE, the organization that Magnus had been feuding with, chimed in. In a now deleted tweet, they quoted the exact same thing Magnus posted after his victory in round 1. A true masterclass in trolling from the FIDE social media manager. Gukesh's comeback was so improbable that even Hikaru Nakamura released his recap early, expecting Magnus to win.
Because this does mean that after a short 3-hour game, now I can relax and get ready for my very big matchup tomorrow against the tournament leader Magnus Carlsen, who had a crushing victory today, his second in the event against the current world champion, clearly not the best player in the world, Gukesh Domoraju.
Regardless, there was still plenty of chess to be played. 3 rounds of chaotic chess later, and the standings looked like this. Magnus Carlsen led the pack, Gukesh trailed by half a point, and both Hikaru and Fabiano were still within striking distance. Real quick, if you're enjoying the video and want to see more chess content, then consider subscribing. Just about anything could happen on the final day. Magnus Carlsen led the standings, and the math was simple. All he needed to do was match or outscore Gukesh in the final game. With the black pieces, Magnus plays a standard Queen's Gambit declined. With the odds stacked against him, Gukesh needs to push for a win. So with the black pieces, he plays the odd-looking h6 and g6. Magnus, on the other hand, seemed to be taking things into his own hands and going for the win, as he plays the aggressive a5 and b5 early on. His setup, however, would seem to come back at him just a few moves later, as he played the defensive knight f6 to block the unbelievably nasty rook sacrifice. This move, however, allowed Arjun to pick up a somewhat free rook, before Magnus picks up a bishop through a fork, followed by an isolated pawn. The position was unbalanced on both sides, and the game was looking like it would be quite the battle. This was only heightened when, after a flurry of tactics, Magnus, who was already losing, had to trade 2 rooks for the queen, leaving behind a 2 knights and rook versus queen and knight endgame. On Gukesh's board, with both sides needing a win to contend for the title, it was clear things wouldn't be so quiet. By the 25th move, Fabiano takes advantage of a completely open queenside to launch an attack with his rooks. And in this position, Caruana finds the only winning move, the brilliant rook takes c6. After it is recaptured, he can slide to a5, threatening the queen and defending his rook. Now, the bishop on d6 can be captured because this pin is no longer useful. After the dust settles, Caruana is up with 2 pieces for the rook, and is now winning. If things remain like this, and Magnus loses, Caruana might actually somehow win the tournament. Meanwhile, this endgame looks very difficult for Magnus. With equal material, Magnus needs to find a way to coordinate his pieces such that he can stop Arjun's queen and knight on the open board. Arjun wins one of Magnus's vulnerable pawns. Things are looking even worse for Magnus now, and if he doesn't win, his fate is not in his hands. So Magnus begins to launch an attack with his pawns, and after pushing enough, Arjun blunders a miraculous draw. Because in this position, Magnus can play the unreal knight g5, fully sacrificing a knight on f6, with the point that if it's taken, Magnus plays check, then he can play yet another sacrifice in rook g3, and if that is taken, Magnus forks, and the pair find themselves in a completely drawn endgame. If the king walks out to the f-file, it's met with another queen fork. Therefore, Magnus can play infinite checks, and a draw will be eventually met. In what could be the most important move of the tournament, Magnus doesn't find it. Instead opting to play it safe with a solid king move. Magnus continues by encroaching on his opponent's position, eventually winning the pawn and then marching his king up the board once again. Arjun grabs a pawn, but this only allows Magnus to grow his advantage. Magnus advances his knight, restricting Arjun's king to just a few squares. He continues suffocating Arjun with the rook. Now, if Arjun isn't careful, he could blunder a rare rook and 2 knights checkmate. Magnus had turned a tricky and lost endgame into a stranglehold. Arjun pins Magnus's knight to avoid checkmate. Magnus plays the rook check and teases a repetition, but instead of grabbing a guaranteed draw, he pushes for a win. This time with the move King G4, which unfortunately is the wrong move to play, as Magnus now has to navigate through a series of checks. Magnus hides his king in the middle of the board. Feeling his lead slip away, just a few moves later, Magnus looks up at the live boards to see how Gukesh's game is going, and he decides to make a threefold repetition, accepting a draw. Magnus had secured at least a point, and things were now on to Gukesh to perform. Jumping back to where we were in Gukesh's game, if he wanted to simply remain alive, he needed to salvage at least a draw from this dead loss position, something we've previously seen in this tournament. Caruana begins slowly improving by bringing his knight back into the play and getting his king off the back rank. After some shuffling, Gukesh's central pawn domination turns into a pass pawn, one that will end up being vital in the conclusion of this game. For now, Gukesh remains in a completely lost position. Fabiano delivers a couple checks, but avoids trading queens to maintain his advantage. After using nearly all of his remaining time, Gukesh centralizes his rook. Fabi moves the bishop, and Gukesh attacks it once more. And attempting to defend the bishop, Caruana blunders by playing f4. With his clock running down, Gukesh finds the best move, simply pushing his pawn, now threatening a promotion on the very next move. The evaluation bar still considers this a complete draw. Despite having a minute 15 on his clock, Caruana doesn't hesitate. He puts the pressure on with the best move, bishop takes c7. All Gukesh needs to do is capture the bishop, and he can trade down into an equal queen and pawn endgame. Instead, with little time on his clock, pure chaos ensues.
Be held to a draw. This is going to go to Armageddon in both matches now.
And we have a queen. On the board, and suddenly
Gukesh
there's a
has
queen.
blundered.
Bishop takes queen.
It's a check, but there's a fork at the end. Gukesh has blundered a knight fork. This is over. Gukesh had the draw in his hands.
Oh, and there you see him.
Oh my God, the heartbreak.
Oh,
The pain.
he
Just having
realized
all of it and surviving. And it's all over for Gukesh.
3, 2,
He's about to be flagged. Make a move.
and we
resigns.
have handshake. Whew.
After having a draw within reach, Gukesh couldn't find it under time pressure, and any opportunity of him catching Magnus Carlsen had vanished.